Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Lecture 102 of the American LGBTQ Museum's new virtual lecture series, Fighting Back, the Lavender Scare. We're excited to have you with us to experience a series of lectures about the pivotal moments, challenges, and triumphs of LGBTQ activism across decades. Before we dive into today's talk, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I am the Chief of Programs at the American LGBTQ Museum, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. In tonight's session, historian David K. Johnson will discuss his groundbreaking book, The Lavender Scare, The Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians in the Federal Government, revealing how the U.S. government targeted LGBTQ individuals during the Cold War. Subsequently, the creative team behind the Up Until Now collective will discuss their acclaimed opera, Fellow Travelers' 10th Anniversary National Tour. After both presentations, Kevin Newberry will lead us in conversation around the rich history of LGBTQ resilience amidst political persecution. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to this evening's speakers. David K. Johnson is an award-winning historian and author. His book, The Lavender Scare, first brought the Cold War-era purge of homosexuals from the federal government to national prominence. It was the basis for the award-winning documentary film, The Lavender Scare, broadcast nationwide on PBS, and has since inspired numerous cultural productions exploring how the gay community of Washington, D.C. experienced McCarthy-era homophobia. A new edition of the book with a new epilogue was published in 2023. His most recent book, Buying Gay, How Physique Entrepreneurs Sparked a Movement, chronicles the rise of a gay commercial mail order network in the years before the Stonewall riots. Buying Gay won the John Boswell Prize from the LGBTQ History Association and the Smithsonian Institution's Professional Prize for Scholarship in Postal History. The Advocate magazine named it one of the best queer books of 2019. As professor in the history department at the University of South Florida, he teaches courses on the post-1945 US and the history of gender and sexuality. After David's lecture, we will hear from the Up Until Now collective. Up Until Now is a collective of artists and thought leaders co-founded by Kevin Newberry, Jekka Barry, and Brandon Kazan Maddox in the summer of 2020 at the height of the global pandemic. Up Until Now is committed to developing and producing interdisciplinary work that helps build new structures for artistic creation across all art and media platforms. They create inclusive, expansive, collaborative spaces that centers stories of empathy, intimacy, and connection. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to David, who will guide us through today's lecture, Exploring the Lavender Scare. Please join me in welcoming David to the virtual stage.
Thanks, Suhaili. And I'm thankful for the American LGBTQ Museum for all you are doing and planning to do to preserve our history, and anxious to talk to the folks from the opera Fellow Travelers. But before we get to do that, I'm going to give you a lecture. I guess it's lecture 102, and it's a lecture you may not have had in school or in your American History Survey course. Obviously, it is about the Lavender Scare. It's a term I use to describe a fear, right? A fear that permeated Cold War America, a fear that gay people had infiltrated the federal government, that they posed a threat to national security, and that they needed to be systematically removed from government service. And ultimately, it's a story of a moral panic, one that I think may resonate with what's going on currently. And it's the story of how this moral panic begins as a kind of fringe movement supported by a few right-wing politicians, but metastasizes and develops and becomes the basis for a government-wide policy, right? And we can date the beginning of this Lavender Scare, this fear, pretty precisely. because of this guy who's next to me here, Joseph McCarthy. You may be familiar with that from your American History Survey course. It begins with this moment that's well known in American history, the rise of Joseph McCarthy in February 1950. He had been a fairly obscure junior senator from Wisconsin until he traveled to Wheeling, West Virginia to make a Lincoln Day address in February 1950, and there he claimed to hold in his hand, a list of 205 card-carrying communists currently working for the State Department with, he claimed, the knowledge of the Secretary of State. And what's a pretty well-known moment in American history, but what people don't realize is that the numbers kept changing. First there were 205, later there were 87, eventually there were 57. And although at first they were all card-carrying communists, later they were labeled other things, loyalty risks, and a much more amorphous category of security risk. 2 weeks later, after much press coverage, McCarthy takes the floor of the Senate and he finally outlines who is on this list. And it turns out 2 of the cases were not about communists at all. They were about groups of homosexuals who had been fired from the State Department. And in telling this story, McCarthy said, "You will find that practically every active communist is twisted, mentally or physically in some way." So he was already making comparisons between communists, alleged comparisons between communists and homosexuals. Chris, we need the next slide. Here we go. So it's really this next moment that really sets off the Lavender Scare, when the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, appears on Capitol Hill. And of course, he's asked about these charges of Joseph McCarthy. And he denies that there are any communists in the State Department, haven't found any, haven't fired any, basically says, right, nothing to see here. But he does admit, under very intense questioning from McCarthy and his allies, that they dismissed 202 people they considered to be security risks. And among these, it turns out John Perryfoy, his assistant, admitted under even more intense questioning that 91 of these people were homosexuals, almost half, right? And it sets off a Lavender Scare. Rather than reassuring the public that the State Department has a robust security system, because moral panics aren't like that, they're not rational. People wanted to know, well, why were they hired to begin with, and where did they go, and did they go to other government agencies, and who hired them? So it sets off this Lavender Scare, and it seems to confirm Joseph McCarthy's otherwise entirely groundless charges. Next slide, please. McCarthy's received a lot of mail. He got a lot of attention because of this, and it was largely because of the homosexual charges. Of the 25,000 letters he received, which are still, by the way, under seal, no historian has looked at them, but journalists who looked at them at the time said that only a quarter of the letter writers were concerned about issues of communism in the State Department, but 3/4 of the letter writers were concerned about this issue of variously called sex depravity or sexual perversion in the State Department. President Truman's top advisors agreed with this. They told him that the country was more concerned about the charges of homosexuals in the government than about communists. And you see this kind of dual attack that McCarthy had, communists and queers, on all kinds of cultural items from the time. This is actually a matchbook cover in support of Joseph McCarthy, and it talks about his fight against treason, right, which is about communism, but also dishonor, right, which invokes this idea of sexual perversion in the White House. In the summer of 1950, there was a series of increasingly serious and expensive and lengthy congressional hearings about McCarthy's charges and about whether or not gay people did pose a threat to national security. This cartoon is from the Washington Post cartoonist Herblock, who is most famous for having actually coined the term McCarthyism that we still use today. And here he's obviously making fun of the fact that Congress is investigating perversion, suggesting that the senators were actually perhaps more perverse than the people they were investigating, right? But it was actually a serious undertaking. They spent a lot of time. They invited lots of guests, lots of witnesses, police officers, security officers, military intelligence folks, security officials. And every single one of those witnesses testified that gay people were vulnerable to blackmail, therefore they could be blackmailed by communists or other enemies of the country, and therefore they were a threat to national security. It was almost like a mantra that was repeated and repeated in the newspapers. The final report that the Senate committee issued stated unequivocally that homosexuals posed a threat to national security, and so that idea got the imprimatur of the US Senate. But the attorney for the committee, who was a lawyer, Francis Flanagan, who I actually got to interview many years ago, as a good lawyer, he wanted evidence, right, for this claim. And he asked all of his witnesses, do you have some proof of this? Do you have some evidence? And none of them could come up with a single example of an American citizen who had betrayed government secrets under threat of blackmail for their sexuality, right? Not one. All they could come up with was this guy pictured here, Alfred Radel, who was head of Austrian intelligence in the run-up to World War I. He was a double agent, worked for the Russians. He was a gay man, but he was not a victim of blackmail. He apparently did this for the money. And that's the only example they had, right? And even in the 50s, this was an example from 40 years ago in another country. Right? So it begs the question, so why did people believe this? Why did the Lavender Scare catch on if there was absolutely zero evidence for this? Right? And there was another congressional hearing in the summer of 1950 that gives, I think, some clues to this. In that hearing, the head of the vice squad of Washington, D.C., Roy Blick, testified that there were 5,000 sexual perverts in Washington, D.C., and that 3/4 of them worked for the federal government, right? And by comparison, there were only maybe an estimated 1,000 political subversives in the city. So it suggested that the real threat to the nation and the nation's capital was sexual deviance. And of course, there was a grain of truth in this, right? There were lots of gay people in the federal government and in Washington, D.C., as there would be in any large city or any large bureaucracy, certainly many more than communists. But it sets up this association in American culture between bureaucracy, Washington, D.C., and sexual perversion that arguably is still with us today in the notion of pedophiles and Pizzagate and things like that with the federal government, and it's a connection that has deep roots, which I think is why the Lavender Scare sort of takes off as a moral panic. Next slide, please. If we go back to the New Deal, that was when this idea, this suspicion between bureaucrats and this association between bureaucrats and gender nonconformity and deviant sexuality begins, partly because the civil service does have a lot of women in it, more so than the private sector did. And with the rise of the New Deal, you have lots of intellectuals coming to the federal government, you have scientists, you have eggheads. So a lot of conservative congressmen derided New Dealers as a bunch of short-haired women and long-haired men messing into everybody's personal affairs and lives, inquiring whether or not they love their wives. Right? They thought that bureaucracy was taking on the role of the family, and objected to it for that reason. So this association between homosexuality, threats to national security, the federal government, it reaches the level of presidential politics by 1952, right, which was the first presidential election since the rise of the Lavender Scare and Joseph McCarthy. And it figured prominently in the election, which of course was between the Democrat Adlai Stevenson and the Republican Dwight Eisenhower. And keep in mind that in 1952, the Republicans had been out of office, out of the White House, for 20 years, right, since before Franklin Roosevelt, and they were desperate to get back in, and they used the Lavender Scare to do that. They essentially gay bait the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson. He's demonized as an intellectual egghead. Journalists said he had a fruity voice. He was a wealthy, urbane, former State Department official when the State Department was associated, because of McCarthy's charges, with homosexuality. The FBI spread a rumor that he'd been arrested on a sex charge, a morals charge. But actually, the most damning thing for Adlai Stevenson was that he was divorced. There had never been a divorced president at that time, and people were suspicious about the reason for his divorce. And tabloid magazines like Confidential, shown here, talked about these rumors about Adlai Stevenson, and talked a lot about his divorce and why, did it have something to do with his masculinity. They couldn't say exactly what the rumors were, but they actually didn't have to, because everybody knew what the rumor was. So Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic candidate, was the kind of person that certainly conservatives said should be removed from Washington, not sent to Washington. And in the 52 election, the Republicans campaign on the slogan, "Let's clean house," right? Let's get rid of all of these undesirable New Dealers who have accumulated in Washington, these political and sexual subversives. So their campaign literature, some of which is pictured here, portrayed the candidates, Ike and Dick, right, as regular guys who were God-fearing men who were for morality, which suggested that their opponents, the Democrats, were opposed to morality, were somehow immoral. To show that Ike and Dick were family men, they trotted out their wives and their children, or in the case of the Eisenhowers, it was actually their grandchildren that they had to bring out to demonstrate their family values. And it was the 1952 election when this tradition that's now become standard, we don't even think about it anymore, the fact that presidential candidates appear with their spouses, and that time, of course, their wives. Pat Nixon and Mamie Eisenhower appeared a lot in 1952, specifically to call attention to the fact that their opponent was divorced. There would be no first lady if you voted for Adlai Stevenson. Right? It was a way of subtly invoking the Lavender Scare. Of course, the Republicans win in a landslide, and one of the first things that President Eisenhower does is sign an executive order, 10450, that expanded Truman's loyalty program to a much wider security program. And this gets a little wonky, but loyalty is really about membership in the Communist Party. It's about a willful desire to overthrow the government. Having actually done something like joined the Communist Party. Whereas security is about character, it's about suitability, it's about trustworthiness, it's about vulnerability to blackmail, it's about something one might do in the future, not having done anything yet, right? So it essentially bans anyone guilty of sexual perversion, any LGBT person, from serving in the federal government. It basically institutionalizes the Lavender Scare and makes it a government-wide policy. And that allows the Republicans, Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, to claim that they are kicking the communists and the fellow travelers and the security risks out of the government by the thousands, right? The thousands was true, but most of them were security risks. There were very few communists or fellow travelers they were kicking out. But by lumping them all together, they get to claim this great victory and these great numbers of dismissals. So this is how a kind of fringe idea, right, that gay people are a threat to national security, started by a fringe person in Congress, a backbenching Republican senator, becomes a federal government policy, right, that lasts for 20 years for the whole government and another 20 years in some sectors of the government. So now I wanted to, that's sort of macro level look at the Lavender Scare. I want to now turn to how it affected individuals, right? How it affected gay men and lesbians in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And for that, I'm going to use the example of Madeleine Tress, partly because we have her FBI folder, and also because I was able to interview her a few years ago. At that time, in 1958, when she started with the federal government, she was a 25-year-old white woman beginning a promising career in the Department of Commerce. She had stellar credentials. She had a BA from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. She had an MA in international economics. But before she could begin her career in international economics, right, she had to pass a security investigation. So what did that mean? It meant the FBI would interview her friends, her roommates, her former colleagues, her former professors. Many of them told the investigators that Madeleine Tress wore mannish clothing, that she was not at all feminine. So they suggested to them that they needed to look further into her record. And so they wanted to interview her. And Madeleine Tress remembers that she was at her desk in April 1958 when two FBI agents came and asked her to go to their office for what they called an interview. She was asked to take an oath, to swear an oath before the interview. She asked if she could have an attorney. She was told she could not. They asked her some routine questions about her name and address, and then they asked her the question that changed the course of her life. They said, "Miss Tress, the commission has information that you are homosexual. What comment do you wish to make regarding this matter?" Madeleine Tress froze. She didn't know what to do. She knew if she told the truth that she was a lesbian, she would lose her job. She also knew if she lied about it, she could lose her job for that. So she said she had no comment and adamantly refused to discuss the matter. But these investigators had more questions for her. They asked her if she'd ever been to the Redskins Lounge. And thinking, well, there was nothing illegal involved in that, Madeleine Tress admitted she had been to this lesbian bar in Washington, D.C. She said she liked the music there. They also asked her if she knew a bunch of women. They named their names, Kate Johnson, and dropped a bunch of names of people the investigators considered known homosexuals. And Madeleine Tress, again, thinking there was nothing illegal involved, admitted she knew these people, said she, liked them because of their intellectual appeal. But that was enough for the investigators to call for her resignation, that she had been to a gay bar and associated with other gay people. And so she knew she had no other options, and the next day she resigned. The term that was used at the time was that she resigned voluntarily, although there was nothing really voluntary about it. There were, in fact, thousands of gay men and lesbians who suffered this fate, and sometimes the results were more tragic than losing a job or even losing a career. In the case of Andrew Ferenz, he was a State Department employee at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. In 1954, he was interrogated about his relationship with his roommate, and he confessed to homosexual activity, and he went home that night to their apartment in Paris. He turned on the gas stove and he asphyxiated himself. There were probably many more people who also committed suicide that we don't know about. We know about Andrew Ferenz because the State Department tried to cover it up, tried to cover up their role. They made up a story that he was in bad health. And the family didn't believe it. The family investigated. The family got a member of Congress involved, and there was a paper trail that opened up, and I was able to find that in the National Archives. We do know that the State Department alone fired 1,400 suspected gay men and lesbians in the 50s and 60s. So my estimate is that about 10,000 suspected gay men and lesbians lost their jobs in the Lavender Scare. And most of them, like Madeleine Tress, resigned quietly, didn't put up much of a fight. But about the same time, next slide, please, there's Another guy, Frank Kameny, who was an astronomer, worked for the federal government. He had a PhD from Harvard. He was also fired from the federal government. And as a kind of nerdy scientist, he didn't understand what that had to do with his ability to be an astronomer. He'd wanted to be an astronomer all his life. He loved astronomy. So he fought his dismissal. He fought it administratively. He took it to court. Eventually, he petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to hear his case. They said no. But in the process of fighting his own case, he kind of reframed the issue. He said, this is really not about national security. He knew he wasn't a threat to national security. He said, this is really not about morality. He said, this is about civil rights. And that he was being treated unequally, similar to the way religious and racial minorities were being treated. And he loses his court case, but he begins to organize people in Washington, D.C. By 1965, they're picketing in front of the White House, something that had never been done before. And perhaps even more important than that was that Frank Kameny helped other fired federal officials bring suits to the courts. And by 1969, July 1969, actually, they're winning. And the big case was Norton v. Macy. Norton was a NASA employee. He sued the head of the civil service, John Macy, and won because the U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C. said that the government can't prove any connection between Norton's off-duty conduct and his ability to perform his job. And that was the beginning of the end of the Lavender Scare. It took the civil service another 6 years before they finally ended the ban on gays and lesbians. They didn't do that until 1975, officially. But even then, this association between gay people and as threats to national security lingered in national security agencies, in the CIA, the FBI, the State Department Foreign Service, the NSA. And there were people who fought, a few people who won the ability to have a security clearance. But essentially, the Lavender Scare in these agencies lasts another 20 years until the 1990s, until 1995, when President Bill Clinton finally signs 2 executive orders outlawing discrimination based on sexual orientation in federal jobs and also in the granting of security clearances. And that is when the Lavender Scare finally, officially, legally ends. And you might ask, right, why Bill Clinton? Why the 1990s? Well, 1992 was the first time the gay community collectively put its support and money behind a presidential candidate, behind Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, as a candidate, embraced the gay community in a way no previous presidential candidate had. So that means that it was politics, both at the beginning and the end of the Lavender Scare, right? In the 50s, it was a political tool for Republicans to gain office, and it ended in 1990s because of the political power of the gay community. And by the Obama administration, Frank Kameny, seen here shaking President Obama's hand, he's acknowledged as a kind of hero of the movement. Obama's Secretary of State, John Kerry, apologized for the Lavender Scare in the State Department. And by the Biden administration, the pride flag was being raised out front of the State Department. And the State Department spokesperson said at that time in 2021, "Today we fly the pride flag for Andrew Ferenz and the numerous other colleagues who decades ago took their own lives when the State Department investigators confronted them, harassed them, and intimidated them." So I'm going to end with this little quote and this image. I think the Lavender Scare, it gets trotted out certainly at Pride in June, as part of LGBT history, and it's an important part of LGBT history, but it's also an important part of American history. This is Billy Graham. You all know Billy Graham. He's one of the most important preachers of the 20th century, friends to presidents. He praised Joseph McCarthy in the 50s for exposing what he called the pinks, the lavenders, and the reds. right? But if we teach only about the Red Scare, we're only telling part of the story, right? And Billy Graham's comment makes no sense if you don't also know what the Lavender Scare is, right? So it's my argument that the Lavender Scare is an important part of American history, one you may not have heard about in school, but hopefully that future generations will be hearing about in school. So that's lecture 102, and I will pass it over to Kevin.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That was so fascinating, and I'm such a huge fan of your work. It's been such a big influence on me, so I'm honored to be here with you. So, and I'm so happy to be here with everybody virtually. So my name's Kevin. I am a theater, opera, and film, television director, a little rock and roll, based here in New York City. And Fellow Travelers, the opera, has been a very big part of my life for almost 15 years. So the whole project started with Thomas Mallon's incredible novel. Hopefully many of you have read it. If not, I highly recommend it, called Fellow Travelers. It was published in 2007. And at the time, it was really one of the first books to address the Lavender Scare. It's historical fiction. So it's a love story about a young, eager, want-to-be politician named Timothy Laughlin, who moves to D.C. in 1953 and meets a very striking older diplomat in the State Department named Hawkins Fuller. And they have a love affair that is set against the backdrop of the exact time period that David was just telling you about, the Lavender Scare. So my good friend Sterling Zinsmeier, who is a producer, had read the novel, and he called me and immediately said that it had to be an opera, and he sent me a copy to read. And I read it all in practically one sitting, over 2 days maybe, and I was so struck by the beautiful love story at the heart of this important moment that was filled with political intrigue. And we immediately set about looking for the right team. And the writer Greg Pierce was a good friend of mine at the time and still is. And Sterling knew Greg as well. And it turns out that Greg knew Tom Mallon. And so we reached out to Tom, and he graciously gave us permission to adapt the novel. Not only gave us permission, but kind of gave us carte blanche to adapt it however we wanted. Tom's one note was to make sure that we took Tim's religion seriously, and that we didn't poke fun at that, which we did. And so then we started looking for the composer. And at the time, I had just met this wonderful young composer named Gregory Spears. We were all pretty young at the time. I was born in 1977, so I'm 47. And just a side note, I consider it my duty in my art and as an activist to tell our stories about our shared queer history, and to bridge the gap between the generations ahead of me who taught me so much and mentored me, and the generations behind me that sometimes don't have the same connection to our history. I grew up in the 1980s, and all I saw on television was that if you were gay, you were going to die. And moving to New York in the year 2000, the shadow of the AIDS crisis was all around me. And but I had never heard of the Lavender Scare. This was certainly not something that I was taught in school, as David said. And so I learned a lot when I read this novel. So we reached out to Gregory Spears, this exciting young composer, and Greg immediately responded to the material, and we set about writing it. So Sterling commissioned the opera, and we didn't have a home for it yet. So traditionally in the opera world, a company will commission the piece. I direct a lot of new work, and usually it's one company or a consortium of companies that decides to commission something. So Greg and Gregory started writing the piece, and we didn't have a home for it yet. And at the time, Cincinnati Opera had just begun a collaboration with the Cincinnati School of Music, and it was called Opera Fusion, and it was a program to nurture and workshop new operas. And the team at Cincinnati Opera asked me if I had any projects that I was working on that I thought might be a good match. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm working on this very exciting new opera called Fellow Travelers. And we went and had a workshop in Cincinnati. I believe it was 2014. And this incredible thing happened. We were making this music and telling this story, and everyone from the company would come and sit in the rehearsal room, planning to stay for maybe, 15, 20 minutes. And then they would be there for an hour or for 2 hours. And in the middle of the workshop, the Cincinnati Opera committed to the premiere. And I get very emotional talking about this because we had sent the opera to several companies around the country, and it was Cincinnati Opera that decided to take the risk and tell this very, very queer story. There are 9 people in the cast. 2 of our leads are actually joining us here today. I'm going to bring them on in a bit to have them join our conversation. And we opened in 2016 at Cincinnati Opera. We happened to open on June 16th, and on June 12th of 2016 was the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting. I remember like it was yesterday being out at a small community gay bar in Cincinnati with many members of the cast and creative team, and then finding out when we woke up the next morning that this terrible tragedy had happened. And so that was a real undercurrent that influenced the emotional heft of premiering this opera at this particular time. And the audience loved it. And luckily the press loved it. We were on the Best of the Year of the New York Times that year. And the opera has gone on to have 16 productions around the country. My original production has been to many, many cities, and there's a second production that began in Minnesota Opera by the wonderful director, Peter Rothstein. And we have played everywhere from America's biggest cities like Chicago and New York to her heartland in cities like Des Moines and Norfolk, Virginia was the most recent production that I directed. And when we were in Norfolk in February, I believe, of 2023, it was one of the first shows that I was directing coming out of the pandemic where we weren't required to wear masks in the rehearsal space. And we had a couple of returning cast members, including Joseph and Andy, who you'll meet in a moment. And that was a very powerful experience. And I tell this story about how this opera has the power to genuinely shape hearts and minds. And much like that very first workshop we did in Cincinnati, every time we do the opera, people, they don't want to leave. And they want to stay in the lobby and share stories with each other. And I've seen it happen in so many different cities. And on opening night at Virginia Opera in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a pretty conservative military town, right? And they had the same courage to present the opera that Cincinnati Opera did, and every company we've been to so far. And on opening night, this woman ran up to me from across the lobby, and she was crying, and she said, "Kevin, can I give you a hug?" And I said, "Of course you can." And I had remembered her from the dress rehearsal. We had a contingent from NATO that came to the dress rehearsal a few days prior to opening. And she said, "You may remember that I was here with my husband. And I have to tell you that my daughter is trans, and my husband and my daughter have not been speaking for 2 years." And after the dress rehearsal, he called her back up, and she's moved back home, and they haven't stopped talking for 2 days. And he's changed his mind, and you've saved my family. And I don't know how you did it and how I could ever thank you. And that sort of story happens all the time. There are sometimes a few people that get up and leave if they're uncomfortable with the intimacy on stage. It is a very emotional opera and a very intimate opera. I'm going to show you a couple of little clips in a moment. And it's been the single biggest influence on me of any work of art that I've been a part of. And that moment in Virginia, in Norfolk, I realized that we had to take this opera everywhere. I was actually directing Liz Phair's 30th anniversary Exiling Guyville tour, and I was thinking about anniversaries. We all love anniversaries to celebrate our own, events in our own lives and works of art. And 2026 was coming up, and I had just started this company, Up Until Now Collective, with the amazing producer, Jekka Berry, and my partner, Brandon Kazimatics. Jekka had been one of the producers of Fellow Travelers when it came to New York City at the Prototype Festival in 2018. And we decided to begin a national tour, to start planning for a national tour. So we are about to launch in February 2026 a multi-city tour. We're starting at Seattle Opera. Our second stop is Portland Opera. And we are going to about 12 other cities that have not been announced yet, but they will be announced soon. And to say that we need this opera more than ever is a bit of an understatement. I thought I'd read just a little bit of my own personal statement that I released to the press when we were announcing this. Fellow Travelers has been a constant companion in my life for over 15 years. This story and this opera has gifted me lifelong friendships and lifelong collaborators, and it has been a consistent catalyst for connecting with thousands of audience members from many disparate backgrounds across many generations all around the country. I can remember every moment of the journey, from the first time I read Thomas Mallon's novel to the moment I burst out laughing reading librettist Greg Pierce's first crack at the opening scene, to the moment I got goosebumps first hearing composer Gregory Spears' rich chord cluster that sparks when Hawk and Tim's eyes first meet. I remember directing our very first workshop when no one wanted to leave the room, and our opening night in Cincinnati, and every opening night since, when no one wanted to leave the theater. As we prepare to open the next chapter in our Fellow Travelers' journey in celebration of the opera's 10th anniversary, I've been reflecting a lot on my values as an artist and a leader, especially as a queer person making work during a moment when our rights are being challenged and our history and our very existence is being systematically erased. I believe in the power of history. I believe that we stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us, who fought so hard and sacrificed so much for us to have the rights we enjoy today. I believe in the power of art to build community, and I believe in the power of a good love story. And Fellow Travelers is first and foremost a good love story. I invite you to find me in the lobby after the show and share your love story. So Fellow Travelers started as a novel, and then it became an opera. As many of you might know, it was then turned into a mini-series on Showtime, starring the amazing Matt Bomer and Jonathan Bailey, and that premiered in 2023. And I think of this national tour as more than just a tour. It's a bona fide national movement, and we are hoping to build community across the aisles all around the country. And we're so excited to share this piece with everybody in a very big way. We're also planting the seeds that can this indie queer opera come to Broadway? So we're hoping to transfer to Broadway in 2027 after our other New York run, which I can't announce yet. So I thought I'd share just a little 1-minute trailer of some of the key scenes in Fellow Travelers, so you can get a sense of the music. So we can go ahead and cue up that trailer, and then I'll invite my esteemed colleagues, Andy and Joseph, to join me. Thank you so much. Great, thank you all so much. So Joseph and Andy are going to join us. This is the amazing Joseph Latanzi and Andy Acosta, two incredible singers, actors, artists, and all around, inspirational humans. So before I hand it over to you, Joseph, to start a little bit, and love to hear about your experience. Joseph was part of the project from the very beginning. So he was with us for our first workshop and played the role of Hawk Fuller in every production that I've directed so far. And the amazing Andy Acosta played Timmy in the other production, and then eventually joined our production, and they are both two of the stars of our national tour. So Fellow Travelers is an opera that takes place over 16 scenes. It's very cinematic, very theatrical, and Greg Spears' music is absolutely exquisite, as you just heard. So Joseph, I'd love to start with you. If you could tell us a little bit about what your journey with Hawk Fuller has been like.
Sure. Yes, it's been incredible. And it's one of those things. I was in school at the time, as you mentioned, at Cincinnati, and it was just assigned to me, and I didn't have any sort of idea what it would be like or what the impact that it would have in my life. Now we're talking about it, as you say, nearly 15 years on, and that's really, really special. But I remember, similar to you, the first time seeing the material, I cried reading the words for the first time. Learning the music was an incredibly visceral experience, and it's every moment felt special. And I really don't think that's just a retrospect, feeling that I have now looking back on it. It was really a once in a lifetime sort of magical process. And so I'm very lucky to have been assigned it, and I'm very lucky to have continued my association with it. And I love it very much. It's the role that I've sung more than anything else in my life and my career. And it's so personal to me. And yeah, there was a time before it blew up in popularity where I was the only one on the planet who had put a voice to these words and these notes, and that was very special. I'm very glad to share it now, but yes, I have chills just talking about it, and that's not something that happens to me very often.
Joseph, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Greg's music. How
Yes.
would you describe Greg's music to somebody who's new to opera or new to this piece?
Yeah, it's opera is such a big word, and it's hundreds of years of music and history and styles and cultures, and so it's hard to define it in a moment. But Greg's music speaks to everyone. It references history, so people who are opera buffs really understand it in a way, and it is completely new. And so people who are hearing it for the first time are enjoying and being affected by it in the moment. And I've seen it happen over and over again. Professionals, professional audience members and novices are just swept away by it. And I think that's the thing for me that is the most amazing about it. It's like from the very first moment, it takes you, it's like a roller coaster ride. It takes you and it just pulls you by the heartstrings for the entire evening, and the audience is right there with you. It feels that way also stepping onto the stage right before you step out into the lights. It's very, very special.
I don't think, by the way, the original cast recording is on Spotify and all music platforms. So we encourage you all to listen to it before you come see the show. Yes. Joseph's on that recording. The amazing tenor Aaron Blake, you just saw in that video, was our original Timmy. And the structure of Fellow Travelers, it's so well crafted. Going back to the comment that woman said to me in the lobby in Virginia, and I don't know how you did it, but the thing is, we actually know how we did it, and the way that Greg's music kind of folds in on itself. And so it's all, the opera begins and ends in DuPont Circle. It begins with Joe McCarthy's wedding in 1953 and ends with his funeral in 1957. The miniseries, as you may know, expanded the whole story into the 1980s through the AIDS crisis, but the opera, like the novel, is very tightly constructed. And the way that Greg Pierce's libretto, it's so sharp and funny and emotional. And I have stood in the back of the theater. I never sit. I always stand in the back of the theater and pace, typical director. And I can tell you exactly when the audience shifts in their seats during that first love scene. I can tell you when they're going to laugh, and I can tell you when they're going to cry. And they start crying about, it's about like 20 minutes, 25 minutes, before the end of the show, and they don't stop. And you hear audible sniffles. And you see, we love our straight allies, but you see some of our straight men in the audience that are uncomfortable in Act 1. And then by Act 2, they're holding their wife's hand or they're holding their son's hand, and they're feeling that they're connected. There's a moment at the end of the opera where I'll let Andy talk about this a little bit, but well, Andy, why don't you tell us about your journey with this role and how you've connected to it over the years?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Oh my God, this piece has also completely changed my life. I was first introduced to the piece when I was a young artist with Minnesota Opera, and I remember I was in my apartment, and I like sat down and read the entire score in front of my piano, and I was just a mess at the end. I had never read a piece that I felt was able to tell a lot of my own personal story as well. I didn't live through the Lavender Scare, but I felt like so many parts of Tim's Catholicism was my own story. We've talked a lot about the theme of guilt that Tim's journey has in this piece. And every time that I do this piece, it shows me a new version of myself. It shows me a new version of those around me. And I feel like it is the piece in my artistic career that has helped me continue to evolve as a person. And that's why this story is just so important for us to continue to tell, especially in, the world that we're living in today.
That's so beautiful. And I'm just the biggest fan of these two amazing artists and every artist whose hands and hearts and minds have touched this piece over the years. And I wonder if either of you could talk a bit about the intimacy on stage. So it was very important to me that the opera really reflect the intimacy of this relationship. I mean, it's a very sexy, hot series of scenes in certain moments, and we didn't shy away from any of it. And I think it's important for people to see intimacy between, queer people on stage. I think we actually hold up well with the miniseries, which was very, shall we say, sex positive. So I'm wondering about if you could both talk a little bit about kind of the vulnerability and the craft of bringing that level of intimacy to the stage, especially in opera. We don't see it very much.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start if you don't mind. And I wanted to say in comment on what you just said, opera, oftentimes we think of it as archetypal and giant overarching stories, mythologies or old tales that get passed down. But this is so incredibly personal, and that's sort of the beauty of this piece, is that it's on a personal level to the performers, both of us, and it speaks to a very intimate group of characters. But the physical intimacy is also requires quite a lot of bravery, I think, and there's an element of trusting myself, and trusting the audience to go along with it as we go. But I remember you always being adamant about needing to share that, and I think it is so important for audience members to be, in some cases challenged, in some cases presented with, and this sort of thing. I always get. There's a little bit, I'm very, I get nervous about it. I get nervous and I'm starting to blush right now a little bit thinking about it.
Very
Yes, I'm very modest, unlike Matt Bomer. And no, I don't know if we want to invite those comparisons. That was very steamy.
Yeah.
But yes, ultimately, once you get to that moment with the music and the words, it makes perfect sense in the moment. And it's magical. It's like jumping, skydiving or something. You're nervous building up to it, and then once the moment happens, it's the only natural thing that could have happened between those two people at that time, and it's beautiful. And it's perfect. from I think from a performer perspective, from an audience perspective.
And Andy, I'm wondering, that's so beautiful, Joseph, like as an actor, like I never feel like you two are acting, or actually anyone that's ever, been a part of the show. It feels just so visceral and real. And I'm curious about how you navigate the emotional journey. I mean, Tim really gets put through the ringer in the course of this, 2 hours and 15 minutes. So how do you approach that as a craftsperson, as an actor and a singer?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I do want to speak to the intimacy part really
Please
quick.
do.
I feel like the beauty of that moment, especially it being so early on in the show, is that as actors, I feel like Joseph and I are in a place where we are thrown into trusting one another on stage in a way that I think every actor or every singer has felt a few times in their career, hopefully. And we sort of always try and be as much in the moment as we can. But there's something about the intimacy that meets what feels like the same stakes as the characters have. And it creates this moment where we're just really there with each other, and we have each other, and we're like, hey, we're going to do this together. And it's a really difficult thing, but it's really, really awesome. And it creates this just magical moment. And for me, to go back to your question, Kevin, there's a part of the way that the show has been written that there's no way to do the show, because from scene one until the scene after the intimacy scene, I typically don't have any break at all. So you are getting true Andy and Tim in this show, and there's no way to hide that. And I think that that's what creates a lot of the beauty. There, like Joseph was saying earlier, there's so many different versions, or I guess evolutions of this genre that is opera. And I think in a lot of ways, you get some of the extremes in this show, and the way that it demands so much of the singers, but you also have such little room to cover things in a way that other shows are sometimes written to allow for that time.
And there's a whole nother show happening backstage, right? Because everybody is changing costumes and wigs. Well, you don't change your wigs, but you don't have wigs, but the ladies are all changing their wigs and their dresses, and it's one thing moving after another. And our approach to the physical production, we really wanted it to feel like a ballet. So, we're traversing all these different locations. So the basic design is these sort of units that have filing cabinets on the one side, and more naturalistic little oases of naturalism. Tim's bedroom, Mary's kitchen. Mary Johnson is also just one of my very favorite characters ever written. There's a moment at the end of the show, and actually in the workshop, I remember saying to Greg Spears, I said, I have an idea. Could you write another minute and a half of music here, because I want to try something where once Tim finds out that Hawk has named his name to save himself, spoiler alert, everyone just very simply turns their back on Tim one at a time, except for Mary Johnson, who looks at him and says, you're going to be okay, kid. And we see Tim walk off into whatever his future might be. And in that moment, we reveal a whole wall of portraits of people that lost their jobs. And one of the ironies of this time period, as David alluded to, is that it was all about keeping files on people, but those files, most of them have not been released. They've been burned or hidden away. And so one of my very big dreams for the next year, and we're still in the early planning phases and fundraising for it, is to collect as many photos and stories from people around the country who lost their jobs in the Lavender Scare, all the way through the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And unfortunately, this very moment right now, because we know that many of our queer community are losing their jobs at this moment. So if anyone knows anyone or has any connection to people that lived through this time and lost their jobs, then please reach out. We'd love to have them be a part of it, part of our journey. But that moment when everyone turns their back on Tim, I think that's the moment where we're asking the audience emotionally, and who are you in that moment when someone that you care about, when you don't understand something, do you turn your back on them, or do you stay open-hearted? And I think of this opera as an invitation to dialogue and conversation and community. And Jack and I talk a lot about the soft power of art. You know, I am an artist and an activist. I learned recently in our decision about the Kennedy Center that I'm not a politician. Actually, I don't want to be a politician, but I do think of the power of art and activism to come together in in a moment like this. So I think we'll invite David back to join us for a Q&A to whenever David's ready. And I have some questions that have and Suhaili's going to come join us as well, I think. Hi, David. Welcome back.
Hi.
Have you seen the opera yet, David? I can't remember.
I got to see the premiere in Cincinnati.
Oh, that's so amazing. I forgot that you were there. What was your experience of it?
Talk back there, yeah. No, it was amazing. It's a beautiful story. I mean, right, you're able to tell a different version of the Lavender Scare, right? That historians, we try to get at what it felt like, but this really brings it home, I think, to people. And yet is, very historically based. I mean, there are moments when I was watching it and there's a reference, I think it came up on the screen, of a reference to the miscellaneous M unit, right? Which is from my book. I mean, that's the agency within the State Department that was doing all this nefarious stuff. But yeah, it's a beautiful opera. And I true confession, I am not an opera fan, but I loved it. So.
we hear that from a lot of people actually that don't tend to like the opera, that this is the one that they do like. It's really interesting. And and Tom Mallon is just such a really assiduous researcher too, even though it's a fictional story. And one of my very favorite scenes in the opera is that kind of imagined scenario of like what happened in that room. I mean, maybe Joseph, you could speak to that a little bit. And I don't know, David, if you have any more thoughts to add from your own work about what actually happened in that room. But Joseph, you want to just talk about that scene a little bit, because it is very powerful.
Sure. Yeah, I loved hearing about the interview earlier. I mean, hated hearing about it, but it was so interesting to hear the account, the first-person account of this interview. Have you been, to these clubs? Have you attended, these events? And it's for me as a performer. I mean, I feel like it's humiliating. Well, I guess for me as a character, it's humiliating, but. You're so exposed and you're being asked all of these things. It is an imagination, or maybe of what could have happened. But in the opera, I'm asked to walk across the stage, and these people are, looking at your every movement, and they subject me to a lie detector test. And in the piece, it's beautifully layered, and so sort of the character's thinking of all of these things. He's thinking of Tim, and he's thinking of falling in love with Tim, and he's not a person who falls in love, but he's thinking that he's fallen in love with Tim, and he has to lie about it. He's faced with the moment where he realizes that he has to deny everything about himself. I think we think about it differently now in this generation as maybe they did then, but I think that's something that is very powerful for an audience member to watch, really being put under the microscope, and I think there's even one light right above you, and then there's one chair, and it feels like you are being.
And they ask you, have you been to this gay bar, and you're denying it. The bartender comes out and says,
"Yeah,
missed what is the lie? You just missed some enchanted evening. They gave you some migraines." It's such a Greg Pierce gem.
I try to catch my sibilant S's, which I'm always nervous about. I'm like, gosh, I have to. But wrap it up as this character.
Yeah. So there's a question here from all of our viewers that I think is really the big question of the day, and the question is, what did our community learn from the Lavender Scare, and how can we use that knowledge to deal with the current purging of federal workers? I mean, David, do you want to start and take that one? Start.
Well, yeah, there's lots of comparisons that are made between what's going on now and then. And it's definitely similar. One of the similarities is that there was no, gay people were not actually a threat to national security in 1950. There was no evidence for this. Similarly, there's no evidence that trans people are a threat to women's sports or to people in bathrooms, or so it's not based on facts. It's based on fears, unfounded fears. The difference between the Lavender Scare and what's going on now is that almost nobody stood up during the 50s and 60s and said this is wrong, including most LGBT people, right? Until Frank Kameny came along, and that's, it's late. Now we have all kinds of organizations, including this one, right? The American LGBTQ Museum and the Human Rights Campaign and Lambda Legal. But so I don't know, what did we learn? You do need to stand up, right? And say this is wrong and say this is not based on any facts. And back then, the courts were our friend. I'm not sure that's still true today, but it might be true. Because the courts actually, ask for usually rational decisions and rational explanation for why you firing these people.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Joseph and Andy, do you have any thoughts on that about how this work affects this question or what you're doing in your own lives?
Yeah, I mean, I if I can speak, I would say I would also echo what David's saying, and I would say history has shown through the Lavender Scare that silence is not going to be a solution. I think it's important for us to continue to tell this story and stories that parallel this, historical repetition. It is why I know I am so emboldened to continue to tell this story because it feels like it is the time to say it as loudly as we can. And there are so many parallels to the Lavender Scare that are going on right now, even with what we're seeing with illegal deportations and everything in our politics today. So I think it is important to advocate as strongly as we can and to try and get our people together to continue to gain a louder voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Joseph, anything you want to add to that?
I would just say that I'm glad that you're so adamant and up until now is so adamant about claiming the activism. I don't, it feels helpless to me sometimes as just a person who sits and watches the news. I don't sit on my couch and think of myself as an activist necessarily. And as an artist, I think of, my goal is to sort of try to execute the story as faithfully as possible. But I think I've sort of been personally converted by watching the effect that it's had on people, audience members, and yes, so I'm very glad to be under the umbrella of you all with such strong voices.
Oh, we're so honored to be on the journey, with you both. And, I've been thinking a lot about activism at the height of the AIDS crisis. I heard a really wonderful podcast recently about, the different kinds of activism. And they were talking about ACT UP and the AIDS quilt and how they were happening simultaneously, like really side by side. You had ACT UP, burning the effigy of Fauci and dumping their lovers' ashes on the lawn. And, and protesting in a very big way. And then right next door was this unfurling of all of these beautiful quilts that had been made by mothers and grandmothers and sisters that often were not allowed to speak about their son's death in their own town across America. And, I'm going to get really emotional talking about it. I've been thinking a lot about, what kind of activist am I as an artist right now, and am I am I an AIDS quilt, activist or an ACT UP activist? And in many ways, the work speaks for itself. And I've always wanted the opera to speak for itself, but we're also in a position where we are being given a platform right now. And I just feel so honored to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of what this incredible museum is building. I have a couple of questions in here. How do we learn more about the opera's future tour schedule? You can visit our website, upuntilnowcollective.com, and our Instagram and social media is a great way to stay updated. I believe on our website right now, the Seattle Opera press release is there. And so the dates are all there. And then Portland just announced. And oh, how I wish I could tell you all the other places that are doing it, but I just can't yet. But we'll be releasing it pretty soon. And I suspect in a couple months, we'll be doing a big press release that will announce the next few legs of the tour. So we hear this question of, what is the role of art and artists, literary visual performance, and LGBTQ plus activism today? I mean, that is such an amazing question. Yeah, David, anything you want to start with?
You're the artist, Kevin.
Well, you're an artist too, right? You're like a literary superstar. Yeah. What about Joseph and Andy? Anything you want to kind of add to that?
I think you spoke to that sort of beautifully just a few moments ago. And I do wonder that, all I can speak about, I guess, is my personal experience. But I wonder what the difference between me making daily choices makes in the minds of people who I know. I mean, and it can be as simple as me deciding to maybe post a photo of me, and kissing Andy on social media or something like it related to the show, and what that means for my extended network of people at home, people who have seen me sing very traditional operas, or people who grew up in church with me, things like that. And I think it can range from something like that to making big bold proclamations. So I certainly don't know the answer, but I think I'm trying to find for myself what feels true to me.
I really appreciate that comment about visibility. What does it mean to post those photos of this real intimacy? As I think Joseph and Andy know, I told a story on PBS's Stories from the Stage for Pride last year, and it was all about my grandfather and this amazing gift that he left me posthumously in a time capsule, and it was his dog tags from World War II, and what it means to report for duty and to stand up for our community and to share these stories. And that was so vulnerable. I mean, I love doing panel discussions like this, and I love leading a room, but to tell my own story on television and to have to memorize it and keep it in time and not cry. I mean, you both know me so well, right? And that was like a big step for me to actually come out and tell a very personal story on that stage, and that's out there right now. There's no, I can't hide who I am and the work that I've been doing. And so I appreciated what you said about that visibility. Andy, what would you like to add to that, superstar?
Yeah, I think, I think the thing that my hope in telling this story and stories in general is just to get together with a group of fellow artists like you all and put our heads together in a way that we can create something that is going to give the audience a perspective that is not going to tell them what to think, but rather invite them to ask questions about their life, the life that they're living, and the ways in which maybe the story that we're telling will give them some sort of perspective on someone else's story, and ask questions to those around them, to themselves, when they leave the theater, of how it is that they want to continue to live their own life, and whether they want to do something to change it or to better someone else's life as well.
That's so beautiful. And this is a three-pronged project. So we have the opera tour itself, this archival research project that I'm really hoping that we can get going this year. It's a big lift. And we're also in pre-production, very early stages for a documentary. So Andy and Joseph, I don't know if you even know this yet, but we're hoping to bring some, cameras along for the journey to capture not only the tour itself, but the audience response, and hopefully interviews with people that lived through this time, and I mean, I love the documentary, David, based on your book, has so much of that similar. We have so much to talk about and so many notes to compare. And we have a really stellar producing team. And so we're in the early phases for that. And I consider that part of the same thing that we're talking about, right? Of how do we preserve this story and this process and how it shapes our culture over the next couple of years. And I mean, I have such like a, ADD brain. I love having lots of projects going on at once. And I'm looking at the next 2 years where I'm going to be doing Fellow Travelers at least 12 times, if not 15. And, and part of this conversation about what it means to be an activist and to be present and to lead community is that I want to be in each city. I actually, we have a couple things where there's some overlap. So I can't be everywhere because we're booking it so much, but I really want to be in each place because I want to see opening night. I want to be part of the discussions and I want to experience the audience response. So, and David, we'll have to invite you to come to certain cities and be part of these conversations too.
Absolutely, I'd love to. I want to quote someone in the chat. The Lavender Effect says, "Your art is a form of activism," right? And they're right? It's all about telling our stories, telling our history. It can change people's lives. There are in fact statistics, right, about if you know an LGBT person, your view on their rights changes. Mm-hmm. And also the history, I think, is important as a historian, of course, but because I think there's been a tendency to think, the gay community is somewhat privileged. You people haven't experienced discrimination. The history says another thing, right? So we need to tell that history.
Mm-hmm. David, I wonder if you could make some recommendations of places that people can look if they want to know more about this period, in addition to reading your book and watching the documentary. But where else would you send people if they want to learn more about this?
Besides my book and the
start there, everybody. Start there, yeah.
There is a new edition of the book, so people can get that. The Lavender Scare, I think the documentary film is available for streaming. What else? I don't know.
Is there a place where I'm a big fan of what the Mattachine Society does, and there's a wonderful organization called History Unerased that tries to bring these stories into schools, and I think there's some amazing archives online to dive even deeper into some of these things too.
Yes, John D'Amelio's work. He was a previous presenter for the museum. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is so exciting. Yeah, and I wonder. I'm curious what the museum is planning around this particular topic. So I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. If we want to bring Suhaili back to kind of wrap us up, or we have a couple more minutes if anyone else has anything they want to add. Great. So Suhaili, do you want to come back on and join us? And if you have any final questions or thoughts or any insight into what the museum is doing in the future around this topic?
Yeah, it's so exciting. I just first want to thank you each for your wisdom and sharing your experiences and your art and activism with us. Thank you to everyone who joined in. We appreciate your presence. That is still unfolding. We're having many conversations about the type of content that will be featured at the museum, both in exhibitions and public programs. So there are many outlets to explore various points across history where LGBTQ plus people were engaged. And so that is all forthcoming, and we look forward to sharing that with you all. Our first physical galleries, as many of you know, will open in New York City in 2027. So stay tuned for that. If you're not in New York, please make plans to be in New York. This will be a very celebratory, historic occasion, and we would love all of you to join us there in New York. at that date. But obviously, you do not have to wait until 2027. We are producing public programs and traveling exhibitions all over the country. If you are based in Los Angeles, we invite you to join us for Queer Expressions in the Natural World, which is happening next week on Saturday, May 10th. This will be an immersive program where we will unravel the profound connection between our Earth and the resilient spectrum of gender and sexual identities. If you are a book lover, which I know this entire panel is, and many, I'm sure, or all of everyone who's joining us in the chat, we invite you to join us and over 500 members across the country in our Lavender Literary Society book club. Our next author talk is on Wednesday, May 28th, in collaboration with the Smithsonian American Art Museum on the occasion of World Pride, and we will highlight Black, Queer, and Untold by John Key, who will be in conversation with Kimberly Drew. Again, if you're on social media, please follow all of our wonderful panelists. Please follow the American LGBTQ Plus Museum across all social media channels. And if you're interested in supporting our work and programs like Fighting Back, we invite you to consider joining us as a founding member of the museum. I want to thank everyone again for their time and wishing you all a good evening. And we look forward to seeing you at upcoming American LGBTQ Plus Museum programs. Goodbye. Thank you.